Okay, so here's a little video to give you some feedback on the re-exam of Organizing Growth. And I hope that through this video you will get a good understanding of why you got the grade you got. Okay, so this table you probably already know. It just means that the way the grades are given is that there are 100 raw points to be distributed. You can get 50 points from the first question, 20 from the next, and 30 from the last one. And depending on how many raw points you get, it translates into the grade, as you can see it here in the table. So the questions were these, and of course it's important that you answer the questions good, but in answering the questions, it is also important that you demonstrate that you have understood or achieved the learning objectives. And the questions are made in a way so that it is possible by answering the questions to show that you have achieved the learning objectives. And these are the learning objectives. So as you can see, when you look down over them, they can roughly be divided into two things. There's a lot of describe and classify, and in number 2 again describe, later it's identify, evaluate. These kind of things is more related to showing that you understand the theoretical frameworks. Whereas in objective 2 you can see it also says develop co-creating capabilities, and in question 4 it says, or in learning objective 4, it says, let's see, show ability to apply these in practice. So that is more, there you go beyond understanding, and you talk about how you have to write something in your paper that shows that you are able to apply the theory in practice. Good. So in the following, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basic mistakes that many of you do that does not help you, well actually it doesn't help you answer the questions, and it also doesn't help you demonstrate that you have achieved the learning objectives of the course. So the first of these is buzzwording. Like buzzwording is when you write a piece of text where you use a lot of concepts, often you use a lot of them in close proximity, but you don't demonstrate any real understanding of these concepts. So you can, here's one example. It says the co-creation, or the creation story, as explained above, was embedded in every episode of our channel. This was done deliberately to create a cultural connection and develop authenticity of the products and videos we created, and further facilitate the creation of meaning and the kind of value as assigned as stipulated by Susan Boss-Tepe. So this creation story, cultural connection, authenticity, creation of meaning and value as sign are not really defined, or there's nothing in this text that shows an understanding of these concepts. Of course, some of them are defined later in the text, but some of them are not, and this is problematic. Here's another example. You can read it for yourself. Maybe you can pause the video if you wanna read it. And again, the highlighted concepts, some of them are dealt with later in the paper, but some of them are not really dealt with. So it's kind of just throwing in a lot of buzzwords, but never really demonstrating any understanding of these concepts. So here's a third example where concepts are sort of thrown into the text without demonstrating any real understanding. It starts off very nicely. There are 4 skills to be mastered by the artist to ensure a successful process, although actually they're not really skills. Only the first one is a skill, the other 3 are more descriptions. So the release needs to be mastered good, but then it goes gradually more and more, becomes gradually more and more superficial, And in the highlighted text it says, out of collaboration comes ensemble. And then maybe we could expect an explanation, but we don't get an explanation. We just get a restatement, which can be said that the outcome of, which can be said to be the outcome of collaboration. So it comes out of collaboration, and then it can be said to be the outcome of collaboration. That's a truism. Doesn't demonstrate any understanding. And then comes something else, like what is important to notice here is that the result of the collaboration is greater than the sum of the individual group member, of each individual group member. Fine, again, something that is picked out of the book, but it is not described in a way so that it demonstrates any understanding of what does that mean. What does it mean that it's greater than the sum of of each individual group member, or greater than the sum of the parts? Okay. Another thing is, of course, sometimes you will actually describe the concepts more in detail, but your description does not show that you have understood the concepts. The description shows that you have misunderstood the concepts. And of course, that does not give many points. So here's an example of a text that shows a misunderstanding of a concept. So the quote in the beginning is very nice. It's a nice introduction to talking about listening. However, listening is not a ritual. Ritual are concrete repeated activities. And you may have a ritual that includes listening, such as sitting in a circle and using a talking stick, but listening in itself is not a ritual. Listening is indeed more difficult with diverse groups, as is written, but it would be good to say exactly why this is so. Namely because in diverse groups the ideas of other participants might be more foreign to you and thus harder to understand. If something like that had been in the text, it would show more understanding of listening. Finally, the last sentence seems to confuse the stages of dialogue, that is the 4 conversational fields, with the skills needed to move through these stages. This may simply be a linguistic slip, but writing stages instead of skills fundamentally changes the meaning of the sentence. And as an examiner, I have to base my grading on what is written. I can't guess that, maybe they didn't mean stages, maybe the author meant skills. But maybe also just shows a sort of vague grasp of the concepts. So one of the concepts that, to my surprise, many of you struggled with was the concept of creed from Hanlon's primal branding framework. So this is an example of where the author writes about the channel and their creed, and starts off again with a nice definition actually of what creed is, but then goes on to say that the creed of this particular channel was brought together by our love of food and nostalgia for snacks from our home countries. We embarked on an ambitious journey to try the best snacks of every country. Now, this isn't a creed. This is what you did. This is your mission, if you like. The creed isn't just the mission. It is the belief that drives the mission and makes the mission meaningful. So actually, the second piece of text, which is from the same paper but found later and not in a section where the author writes about creed, expresses the creed of the channel much better. It says, food does not only provide nutrition, but represents memories, emotions, and identities. By introducing those food, we can also share our cultural background and let people know more about us. This is a kind of belief that would make the previously stated mission meaningful. This is the kind of belief that would drive you to engage in such a mission. So yeah, then I have, just to clarify it a little bit, I have written down excerpts from 2 papers where I believe they stated their creeds very well. In one, which is the channel Entrepreneurship Explained, the author simply says the creed is everybody could be an entrepreneur. If you believe that everybody could be an entrepreneur, it makes sense for you to create a channel where you bring knowledge about entrepreneurship to everybody. So there you have a belief that drives your mission. And from a paper on the Musicians of Copenhagen sessions, they simply said their creed was for the love of music. So, and then they follow by the mission of MOC sessions is to connect up and connect up and coming musicians and music lovers through their shared passion for music. So it is this love of music that drives that mission. So this is also a nice example of a formulation of creed. But as I said, many of you when you wrote what your creed was, you simply wrote what you were doing, what your mission was. So another thing that many of you did, which demonstrates a misunderstanding of concepts, is that you confused everyday language and theoretical concepts. So in this text, it talks about using check-in as a ritual within the group. And check-in is a really good example of a ritual. You sit down and maybe you have a little circle and each person just says what's up. This is as a way of starting a meeting. This is a good example of a ritual. But then the author goes on to say, this activity boosted ensemble with a reference to Austin and Devon, and it is a source of identification of collaboration, also with a reference to Austin and Devon. Now, it might be true that doing such a check-in boosted some sort of sense of being a team, and it might be true that it enhanced collaboration. But ensemble and collaboration, as Austin and Devon uses it, are very particular concepts, and they're not meant to be used in the everyday sense of these words. This is why Austin and Devon writes them with capital letters in the book, exactly to distinguish them from what we normally mean with ensemble and collaboration. So ensemble is a description of a particular quality that teams who works through release have, and collaboration is the way that a quality of the collaboration from individuals who work through release has. So it's a quality of the collaboration and a specific quality of the team. It isn't just meant to as in everyday language, where ensemble means something like a team and collaboration just means working together. So it's important not to confuse everyday language and theoretical concepts. And here is another example, also where the author misunderstands the concepts of ensemble and takes it to mean something that like what we would use the word ensemble to mean in everyday language. So the author writes about ensemble somewhat synonymously with just the word team. The author writes, I would argue that the ensemble was somewhat strong in our group since different tasks require different skills and mindsets. So we have different people and they take care of different tasks and work well together. But this isn't exactly, as I said before, what Austin and Devon means when they talk about ensemble. A third example of confusing everyday language and theoretical concepts, here related to the concept of responsibility from the psychological sense of community framework. So the author writes about responsibility, where we cannot forget that drinking is bad. So being cautious is important. While drinking, we never forgot about the camera. So we always remembered to behave and tried to keep an acceptable language. So in the SOC framework, the word is used specifically to refer to the responsibility that a member of a community can feel for the purpose of the community, or for taking care of the community. And it is quite unclear here, these actions that are described, which community are the members taking care of. So it seems more to be taken in the sense of that they were trying to be responsible in their actions, but it isn't really linked to creating a sense of community. Okay, so the last one I want to show about understanding concepts is a good example of where the author uses one paragraph to clearly define the 4 concepts of the dialogue, the 4 skills of dialogue. And yeah, you can read the first: listening requires to develop an inner silence and control over control the flow of judgments and thoughts that naturally emerge when listening to someone. Respecting implies to consider others as legitimate participants in the conversation, even in the case of disagreement. And you can see how these definitions are really good because they are short and they pull out the core of each concept. This demonstrates good understanding of the concepts. So the next thing I want to talk about is that sometimes you have good analysis but incomplete analysis. So the first example is a very good observation. It's the observation that not everybody seemed to be needed to produce the content of the channel, and that therefore there was not a feeling of responsibility to one another, but just people just cooperated with the group members to make it work. So this is a good observation. There is something like there's not something to do for everybody, and that has a connection to somehow people not feeling responsibility for the group and for producing the things that need to be produced. And it's a pity that this is not followed up by a conclusion about what this teaches the student about how to manage organizations, which is also part of question 1, or something else that it feels like it is left hanging a bit. So good observation, but it would have been nice with more analysis there. In this next example, it's also some interesting observations and missed opportunities for demonstrating understanding and engaging with the theory. So in the first of the quotes, it is claimed that Jamie Oliver's food tube is a master of primal branding. Now, when you claim that someone is a master of primal branding, it is a pity to miss the opportunity to explain why you think so. By not explaining this, you miss the opportunity to demonstrate that your understanding of primal branding. It's a pity. It's a missed opportunity for good analysis. And in the second quote, it says there's an observation that there is low commitment. So if you observe low commitment level, then that is a perfect opportunity to ask yourself, why is it like that? And to demonstrate your ability to apply the theories that we've been talking about, to explain why there is a low commitment level, and to suggest what you could do about it. So yeah, missed opportunities for analysis. So in this next example, the author mentions all the 5 elements of the psychological sense of community framework. Very nice. But then the author goes on to only comment on 3 of the 5 elements. Now, so this is an incomplete analysis. Now, it may be that the author couldn't find anything to say about 2 elements, but then it is better to reflect on why you can't find anything to say about those two elements, then to simply omit them from your analysis. If you just omit them, it looks like you kind of just forgot them. So in this next example, again, it says, before any actual interviews were made, our interviewer would have a small conversation with the viewers explaining what was going to happen today, letting them feel like a part of a specific target group. So the person would talk directly to the camera, and in this way try to create a sense of community with the audience. And then the author goes on to saying, on the other hand, inside our group, the effort to keep a sense of membership was not so strong among all members. That's, again, is a good observation, and I would have loved to see a more thorough analysis of why were there no effort to keep that sense of membership, and what could you do in the future to ensure that in other groups. So this next one is a rather long text. You may pause the video and read it if you like, but it is an analysis relating to the psychological sense of community framework, and the author starts by saying that there are 5 elements, and then in the following, element number 3 is not mentioned, even though the author actually counts them, so saying like first there's this, secondly there's this, and then the 4th point. So the 3rd point is never mentioned. Again, an example of an incomplete analysis. And also, if you read it through, the analysis here is rather superficial. So the next thing I want to talk about I have called tickboxing. It is the kind of thing where, which many of you do, which is that you seem too eager to tell the reader that you did everything right. So it will be like an analysis of a framework, and then you say, for example, the psychological sense of community, and then you show how you ticked all the boxes, how you created a sense of membership and influence and fulfilled people's needs and so on. This often leads to superficial analysis again, and doesn't really show that you can, it shows you maybe that you understand the theory, but not that you can apply it. So in the first example here, the author made a YouTube channel about Premier League fantasy games. And if you read this description, it's very interesting. First, the author says that he wants to give a sense of membership to the subscribers because he remembers how that felt to himself. So there's a little bit of his motivation. That's kind of nice. But then he goes on to, well, first of all, he doesn't actually say how he intends to give the subscribers this sense of membership. And then he goes on to say something very interesting. He says that having a YouTube channel gives you the ability to influence others. So this is interesting because that gives him the sense to influence others, and maybe that gives him a psychological sense of community. But actually the whole theoretical framework is how you can give the members of the communities, in this case the subscribers, a feeling that they can influence the community. And he does not say anything about this. So, and also in the last one, he also describes how being able to, with this influence that he now have through his YouTube channel, comes a responsibility, because, as he writes, you can now influence others in their views and opinions. So he feels himself this responsibility, which is good and which relates to the psychological sense of community. However, if you want to build up a sense of community, the theory is that you should give the the other members, the subscribers, also a sense of that they can take responsibility for the community. So there's a little bit of misunderstanding of the framework here, and there is too much eagerness, it seems, to tick all the boxes and show the reader that he did all the things right to create this sense of community. The next example I have of this kind of tickboxing says what came out as very important was making the psychological and emotional commitment of every member engaged and alive. This was done inspired by this concept of psychological sense of community. And then they mention the different elements of the community, psychological sense of community, and kind of claims that they ticked all of those boxes by eating together, by doing other social activities together. And then here comes a little bit of buzzwording, because then they pull in the listening and the respecting, and proceeding only with consensus redelegation of tasks to meet schedules, and working on the project together based on shared nostalgia for homes far away. So again, the author mentions all of these elements of the framework of psychological sense of community, and then say, we kind of did all that because we ate together and worked on the project together, and we were all nostalgic for our homes far away. Again, this seems to be written too much with the interest of showing that they did things right, and less showing how they are able to apply the theory to analyze the actual concrete experience of working together on the YouTube channel. So the next category I'm going to talk about is when you make claims and you do not ground those claims in concrete examples. So the first example here, it talks about when assessing the channel's use of icons, it became clear that the implementation of these were not as successful as other parts of the primal code. Okay, so, but the author does not tell us how this assessment was done, and they also do not tell us, or the author does not tell the reader, what are the concrete observations that led to the described conclusion that the channels were not, the icons were not efficient. They just say they weren't. In the next example, they describe a situation where one person in the group suggests to split up the group. And then something happens and they end up not splitting up. And the author claims that this was not moving back to field 1, but instead moving to field 3, reflective dialogue. So, but again, there is not really much description of the observations that told the author that they moved to field 3 rather than field 1. By contrast, here's an example where the author claims that they in the group often improvised, and then the author back up this claim by describing a concrete situation where they improvised. So this is good. This is a claim that is grounded in a description of a concrete example. And here is another example. So they talk about a very specific, or here the author describes a very specific workflow, and then at the end they link this particular workflow to the concept of release, which is correct, and again demonstrate the ability to apply the theory by saying this is how we worked, this is the concrete workflow that we often used, and this is an example of release. Another example of something that is problematic in some of the papers is overclaiming. So making claims that are way too general and too big. So here's an example from one of the papers. First they write, this essay considers the methodological literature on co-creation and community building to examine and reflect on this notion based on the experience developing a YouTube channel. The experience of developing a YouTube channel, I guess it should be. So this makes it sound like the author intend to actually do a systematic and full-fledged literature review on co-creation and community building, and that is of course not the case. So later in the paper, the author makes the much more realistic and much more correct claim, where the author writes, I will begin by discussing co-creation and community building in reference to our personal experience and the methodological literature taught in this course. So there it's narrowed down from a full-fledged literature review to just dealing with the literature presented in the course, which is, so the second claim is a good claim, this is the correct claim, the first claim is way too general. And it's good to be critical of one's claims and say, am I claiming something that is way too general? Can I make the claim a little bit more specific so that it is more precise, more correct? Then when you talk about future actions, because one of the questions was about how can you learn something more general about managing organizational growth beyond the working with YouTube. So in this example, there is this problem that there are no concrete ideas for future action. So the author writes, in hindsight, we could have had more emphasis on putting up the best possible container. Yes, this is true, but how are you going to do it? That could ensure that energy, possibility, and safety was present at all times. Again, wonderful, a container that ensures the energy, possibility, and safety is present at all times. Good idea. How are you concretely going to do that? And then continue and avoid factors that led to a closed power relationship in our discussion. Again, avoiding such factors, wonderful idea. How are you concretely going to do it? And there's a second example of the same. So here the author wrote, we should then seek to collaborate with other channels in which we can find to be relevant and in which we find to be relevant, and then link to their channels and also write comments on their videos. In the long run, it might even be a possibility that we co-create some videos. Good. But the problem here is that what the author says is kind of just restating the question. It says we should make partnerships that are for mutual promotion and possible content co-creation. Yes, but it doesn't answer concretely, who do you want to get into a partnership with? What are those partnerships? What could they look like? So again, there is actually no concrete ideas for future practice. So the last example here in this category is the reverse. So this is an example where the author actually does provide concrete description of specific practices. So the author here is concerned with how to develop respecting in general, and says, well, whenever a conflict began to heat up in an unfruitful way, one or more group members would suggest either a break, a change of topic, or a simple moment of silence. So these are three concrete ways that you can, three concrete actions that you can use to promote respecting, and that they apparently used in the group and had good results with. And they write further down that they didn't just change topic and then they never returned to it, but that after maybe discussing something else, or after having a moment silence or a break, then they would return to the topic. And because this different kinds of breaks had given the people who got a little bit heated time to reflect, then the discussion would be much more fruitful after that. So good example of specific practices. So just to round off this little quick feedback video, I want to give 3 examples of reflections that demonstrate the ability to apply theory and draw out learning for future actions. So these are 3 examples I found in papers that I found particularly good. So the first one here is a very good self-observation. The person just noticed that there was something particular to this person holding this person back from listening, and that was that if this person didn't listen, ignored his or her own thoughts, then he or she would be afraid that maybe all of a sudden they had to answer, and if they hadn't prepared that answer, they would have to take a little extra time, and that might be interpreted as that they had not paid attention. So this is something that isn't just taken out of the books, and that shows me that it is a genuine and good self-observation, something particular to this person. So that's really nice. It's a nice example of engaging with the theory. This next example is an example where the author is concerned with, as they write, as stated above, we wanted to create a process in which we reach the decisions through meetings of minds rather than by someone forcing their ideas through. So, and then the author claims that in this endeavor they failed. And then the author presents the evidence, which is that sometimes they got stuck in opposing views and they had to use voting in order to make a decision. And then the author says, well, actually using voting is just the majority imposing the will on the minority, and therefore it's not something where you really engage in dialogue. And then the author says that this shows that they did not practice suspension. So the author writes, we clearly spent some time in the breaking down field during the project. However, and then the author writes something interesting. However, more often than not, we managed to resolve the conflict by taking a break and giving ourselves time to self-reflect. So this is interesting because this last line says, well, sometimes we had to resort to the vote, but actually most of the time we didn't have to resort to the vote. We just took a break to self-reflect, and then when we came back and discussed further, we could actually solve the polarization. So if this is true that they most often did that, I think that the initial claim that in this endeavor I would argue we failed is too harsh. They might have failed some of the times, but apparently not all the time. So this is a really good reflective paragraph, but in order to make it even better, I would change the line, in this endeavor I would argue that we failed, to in this endeavor I would argue that we sometimes failed. And then I want to round off with this, again a rather long text, but this is one of the best applications of theories I have seen in the papers. So this, I would suggest that you pause the video and read this text, because it shows that application of theory isn't just about showing that you have ticked all the boxes and done the things right. In fact, the author here says we did many things quite wrong, but it also shows the author demonstrates the ability to use the theory to analyze and say this and this and this is exactly what happened and why the collaboration didn't work, and can use this learning to develop ideas about how to handle things differently next time. So this is a really good piece of text. So I hope that this was useful to understand why you got the grade you got, and that it was useful for you to extract some learning and get some ideas for how to write your next paper so that it's a better paper. So have a lovely summer and see you around. Ciao.